new student, we're reviewing maybe some updated knowledge if it's been a little while since you got your license. So today I want to cover airspace, charts, we can touch on regulations, as well as some navigation systems. So I will introduce the basics of the VOR system, enough to pass the written test. VORs are one of those elements where it's not super practical for gliders, but I will also introduce the basics of GPS. It's a great tool, but every tool has its limitations, so we'll discuss that. With that intro out of the way, are there any other specific topics that you all would like to see today? All right. And I've had a really bad cold for about a week and a half from all the high schoolers, so if my voice starts going out, I'll apologize in advance. Okay, let's go ahead and jump in talking about airspace. Who in here needs a sectional chart, just to reference?
I have 3 sectional charts. The current one, can we use the, I know you're not using it for navigation, can we use the Indiana State one?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll go down and grab
Okay,
some.
awesome, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, and this is just to look at and kind of follow along. We really don't need to use a specific or even a current sectional chart right now. Begin our review of airspace by discussing the different classes of airspace. So, start listing the different kinds. What's one of them?
Hey.
Class Alpha, there we go. Okay. What else? B. Yep. Keep going.
C.
C.
All the way to E.
Yeah, so C, D, E, and Class G. These are the main or normal categories of airspace. We also have what is called special use airspace. And we'll move into that shortly. Can everybody see this board? Great. Class Alpha airspace. Anytime we work with airspace, we can think of it in a few different elements. Dimensions, so it's size, which includes distances, altitude, entry requirements, both equipment and pilot and any necessary approval. And then limitations and services. So beginning with Class Alpha, where does Class Alpha begin in the U.S.?
18,000.
18,000, yep. So whenever we are 18,000 feet or higher, up to 60,000 feet, we're in Class Alpha airspace. And that overlies all other airspace in the United States.
60, you said?
Yes, flight level 600. So the dimensions, flight level, because we're above 18,000, 180 to 600. The only reasonable time that gliders will be in Class Alpha is if they're experiencing atmospheric wave. So we can talk about that later on as different kinds of lift, but they're really strong rising currents of air that form wave patterns off mountain ranges when the conditions are perfect. In Indiana, we do not have mountains, we do not have mountain wave. So you will not reach 18,000 feet out of this airport. But as gliders, we can fly into Class Alpha airspace with special procedures. So we'll talk about that. But normally, the entry requirements require an IFR rating, so instrument rating. You can be private pilot, instrument rated. You also have to be on an IFR flight plan and receive a clearance to fly into Class Alpha airspace. For gliders, you need to coordinate with the controlling ATC facility with what's known as a wave window. So often, glider clubs in areas, I believe, what's the glider club outside of Vegas in southern Nevada? No. But there are a few glider clubs around the country. In the Rocky Mountains, Colorado area, California. I think Minden.
Minden.
Yeah, Minden is one of them.
Moriarty, New Mexico.
Moriarty, thank you. Yeah. There are a few sites that are known for those wave conditions. They may have what's called a LOA, Letter of Agreement, with a local ATC center, so that they can give them a call ahead of time on the phone saying, let's activate the wave window. They know the dimensions and how it's going to operate. Those are special local procedures, and before you fly in mountain wave, you need you should have special training for it. Those are not normal conditions that we face here. You fly high, which can require oxygen. It can be very cold. They're long duration flights. So that's advanced soaring. Get special training on that before you do it. Has anybody in here flown in a mountain wave? You have?
Yeah, both in California and New Zealand.
Okay. Yeah. That's great.
It's cold.
Yeah. Sure.
Where
it
in
is.
California?
Williams.
It's up by Sacramento, I think.
It's
North of
about
Sacramento.
50, 60 miles northwest of Sacramento. Well, it's right on Interstate 5.
Okay.
I know of one in Hollister and one in Tehachapi out there too.
Well, great. So, Class Alpha, the size from 18,000 up, overline all airspace. You will not see Class Alpha charted on a chart because it overlies everything else. It's always there. Entry requirements, we've discussed limitations. Again, you either need the wave window or an IFR clearance. And services, ATC coordinates all traffic in Class Alpha airspace. So, it is not necessarily the see and avoid procedures that we use down low when we're in VFR. They see everybody on radar and with their transponder and ADS-B equipment. So they will sequence everybody in altitude and direction separation. All right, moving on to Class Bravo, Charlie, and Delta. These airspaces are towered airspace down low from the surface, going up a certain amount from the local towered airport, and going out a certain radius. Class Bravo is the largest towered airspace. Class Delta is the smallest commonly towered airspace. How I remember it, big city, and dinky or small. So it's kind of a dinky little tower. Class Bravo airspace. Entry requirements, you have to be a private pilot or a specially endorsed student pilot. to enter. So you would need specific training to enter a Class Bravo as a student pilot. And you would have to carry that endorsement with you. In addition, everybody, every time they enter a Class Bravo airspace, has to hear the magic phrase, your tail number cleared into the name of the airspace, Bravo. So our closest Bravo from here would be Chicago. Chicago O'Hare. I'm just going to pull up my chart here and reference quickly. Yep. So as we approach that airspace, before you pass kind of that wedding cake, upside down wedding cake style airspace, before you penetrate that outer boundary, you would have to hear, let's say we're flying 221 Charlie Whiskey, you would have to hear the terms glider 221 Charlie Whiskey cleared into the Chicago O'Hare Bravo. And you would have to repeat that back. At that point, you can enter. ATC provides radar services for all aircraft. They have multiple forms of traffic observation, one being what's known as primary radar. So that is your old-fashioned radio beam style radar. It sends out a radio wave, it bounces off a target or it pings, and it comes back to the station. The time delay and the direction is then calculated to show on a radar scope. It's known as primary radar. ATC also uses secondary radar. That uses the beacon transponder system. So those are the aircraft transponders. There's some written questions for anyone who's studying for the written test. An aircraft transponder is a simple box where you program a 4-digit code. Most of the time, after you program that code, you set it and forget it for our local VFR operations. What is the standard code for VFR flight?
1202.
What is it?
From gliders to 1202.
It is 1202. For normal airplane VFR, it's 1200. So ATC has multiple ground receiving stations, and they can see the transmitted information from your transponder with that code. It also encrypts your tail number. Modern transponders also encode pressure altitude. And resetting the altimeter on our instrument panel does not impact the transmitted barometric altitude. So if you're flying a bit lower than ATC needs, resetting your altimeter doesn't spoof where you actually are. But that's the secondary radar system. And then there's also ADS-B, which we'll talk about later on. So ATC has all these different tools to see and coordinate traffic. And they use that to separate aircraft and make sure nobody gets too close. In Class Bravo, there's also a speed limit. Within Class Bravo airspace, you're limited to 250 knots. Now, the airspace itself is structured like this. It will extend all the way to the ground. And if this is the center of the airspace, it has 3 shelves. Typically, they're about 10 nautical mile radius. So this will extend, well, we'll just use Chicago to be exact. So Chicago is about 6 miles. So we could say it's approximately 5, 10, and then just about 20 nautical miles. The exact dimensions of the airspace depend depends on the local area, and the ATC procedures. So Denver, Salt Lake, those airports have mountains off to their side, so you'll see one side of the airspace is kind of squashed. It's not a perfectly round wedding cake, if you will. On a chart, it is shown as these concentric blue circles. And I'll walk around and show everybody this. You'll see there are blue numbers off on the side that lists the upper limit and the lower limit of each shelf. So there we see 100 over 36. That means the ceiling of the Class Bravo airspace is 10,000 feet. The floor is 3,600 feet on this particular range. So since these outer rings do not extend all the way to the ground, and there's the altitude, it's possible for VFR traffic to fly underneath the outer shelves of the Class Bravo.
And they wouldn't have to have a transponder?
They would need a transponder, but they would not have to talk to ATC.
Okay.
The reason they need a transponder is because outside of modern Class Bravo airspace, we have this magenta, very thin line ring called the Mode C and ADS-B out veil. It's about 30 nautical miles from the center. So even if you don't intend to enter the Class Bravo airspace, all aircraft originally certificated with an electrical system, so not hot air balloons. If you're flying something like an antique J3 Cub that never had electronics on it, you're exempt, but you have more limitations. But most aircraft need ADS-B out and a transponder to operate within 30 nautical miles of that airspace. So our Pawnee, I don't believe, has ADS-B out. Is that correct? Okay. Does it have a current transponder?
No.
Okay. So in the case of our tow planes, they could not fly within 30 nautical miles of Chicago unless they applied beforehand through a notice to the FSDID, Flight Standards District office. Or actually, I think it's the controlling ATC. Yep. So you'd have to let ATC controlling
Chicago
facility.
approach, O'Hare approach.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. But they have to know you're coming ahead of time. Unless it's an emergency, you don't want to pierce that Mode C veil with in-op equipment. So that's one of the limitations. And then services we've already discussed. Now, the reason why Class Bravo airspace has so many rules and why it's complex is because it's designed to sequence a very high traffic volume of primarily airliners into the largest airports in the country. Boston Logan, Newark, Washington DC, San Francisco, LAX, Denver, Salt Lake City, places that will embark and disembark thousands, if not tens of thousands of people a day.
Indianapolis is not Bravo?
It is not a Bravo.
See, that's a,
Yeah.
I know they revised Detroit Bravo airspace recently,
Okay.
because they were out of compliance with FAA regulations.
Interesting.
They were, my understanding is, when you bring an airliner into Bravo airspace, it has to stay there. And they were actually having to take them out of Bravo airspace and bring it back in.
Yes.
Revised the airspace.
Yeah. And so in order to sequence all of those approaches while still providing services to everybody without increasing workload, they will design the airspace based on the instrument approaches and local procedures into that airport. And so Detroit would be an excellent example. It likely had instrument approaches that would run jets either below the shelf and then they'd have to get them another Bravo clearance, or they would have to adjust. Even though a student pilot with proper endorsements can fly on a Bravo, the FAR AIM lists specific Bravos that even an endorsed student pilot is prohibited to fly into. As glider pilots, it would not be a fun day to fly into a Bravo. It is not typically fun if you're a single pilot, even with the best avionics in an airplane. So that's one of those operations. If you're flying through a Bravo, make use of an autopilot, make use of a second pilot. It's a team effort to do it efficiently every single time. But that's, in terms of pilot workload in the VFR environment, a class Bravo is one of your higher workload missions. There are ways, as a VFR pilot, we can fly through a Bravo without actually being on a Bravo clearance. So there are some charts. You can go ahead and load mine up. Called the VFR flyway chart. And you can see it's a different color scheme. It's mainly a white cyan scale, and it highlights VFR flyways. So these are probable paths that a VFR pilot could fly through the airspace on. So these blue arrows, without needing a clearance. And you'll see they specify certain altitudes. So this one travels north and south, at or below 3,500. There's no guarantee flying that line will keep you out of the Bravo, but it will get you very close to being outside of the Bravo. And so in this case, you fly underneath the outer shelf.
You might be able to screen share if it makes your life easier.
That would be
I was
nice.
just thinking we might be able to share your tablet so you could actually put it up on the.
Yeah, you just need to be on the Wi-Fi.
Cool, already connected.
Alright. Clayton, back in May, I flew in the Cedar Creek contest, which is outside of Cincinnati. They're Class B airspace. One of our tasks was around it, close to the, very, very close to the Class B space, and there's a notched corner in the northeast corner of it. And my line of sight to the next thermal was, I would cut across that, and I thought about that. I thought, gee, I know I'm not supposed to go there, but there's my cloud, you know?
It's right there.
So I decided to skirt around the outside of it, and I was glad I did that, but
Yeah.
it was very tempting.
But that's a good decision to avoid it.
But I was right on the edge.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So,
Well, that's Chicago.
yeah, this is still Chicago.
Okay.
This is the VFR flyway planning chart.
Oh, thank you, that's so much better.
And some airspace, honestly, you can get away with busting the limit of it. Class Delta, usually they won't hunt you down. Class Bravo, expect a phone call or expect someone to show up on the ramp before you're even off the grass after you land if you bust Class Bravo.
Wow.
That's something they take very seriously. So you can see coming out from the center, this core of the Bravo extends from the surface up to 10,000 feet MSL. That second shelf goes around, but you can see there's a cutout notch up here. This second shelf extends from 1900 to 10,000 MSL, and so on and so forth. This magenta line is the Mode C veil that we discussed. These blue arrows are the VFR flyways. Those are the advisory VFR paths to remain clear of the Charlie without needing a clearance, with specified altitudes. Sometimes you will see the altitudes change as you fly along that course. And sometimes they're different, east and west, or north and south, to help separate traffic. So you need to remain very aware once you are flying those. And you need to do homework and prep, knowing exactly where you're going to fly before you enter that environment. So like here, we can see fly at or below 2500 all the way over. Now this particular flyway along the western shore of Lake Michigan, from Gary all the way up past Libertyville, begins at or below 3500. But around here we have to drop down. It says at or below 2000. And then at or below
That's because of Midway.
2500. Exactly, because we
okay.
see that lies below Midway. However, we see that blue arrow, the flyway, is rather wide. Part of it is out here in this little slice of the Chicago Midway Class Charlie, those solid magenta lines. This particular slice of the Charlie airspace extends from 2300 up to the floor of the overlying airspace. Anybody preparing for a written test, I would expect multiple questions from the FAA using a figure like this. They may ask, what is the top altitude of Chicago Midway Class Charlie Airport at point 2? And the diagram may have a number 2 highlighted right there. Then we would have to say, okay, it's in this slice. Bottom is 2300 to the top. Underline the overlying airspace. Well, the overlying airspace would be this class, morning, would be this class Bravo airspace beginning at 3600. So working backwards, we see this slice of the Charlie goes from 2300 to 3599. And then the Bravos from 3600 to 10,000 feet MSL. With that explanation out of the way, this VFR flyway, if you are right on the east edge of that shaded arrow, you're in compliance with the airspace. If you're at 2,000 feet, you're good to go. Charlie begins at 2,300, you're fine. But you see that shaded line extends into this sector of the Charlie, which begins at 1,900. So if you were trying to fly along and you're using an iPhone or an iPad with a GPS tracker in it, so you have that moving dot on the map. Maybe you're flying a Vans or Piper Cherokee VFR through here. Just because that dot says you're along the VFR flyway, you still might be busting the Charlie airspace. So you need to be very precise in how you navigate with that. As glider pilots, we're not going to face this because the chances of us being able to maintain altitude within that window, all the way from Gary up past Libertyville while off the coast, is not going to happen. Maybe someday when we get 180 to 1 glide ratios, but not yet. Okay, that's class Bravo airspace.
What about, tell them about so the deck of the class Charlie airspace is 2,300 there.
Yep.
What altitude can they fly under that at?
Yeah, so the class Charlie is very similar to the Bravo in terms of how it's charted. The same general notation, just a different color on these lines. So in this sector of the Midway class Charlie, we can fly VFR from 1899 to the surface without establishing radio comms with the controlling agency. Going back to Class Bravo to wrap that up quickly, we've discussed how we can fly in there on a clearance, discussed how it's charted, limitations. There's one other way you can fly through a busy Class Bravo on a VFR flight plan, and those are known as VFR transitions. They are essentially a three-dimensional tunnel of airspace that often will run you right over the center of, like, LAX has a famous VFR transition. So for those, you have the 200 knot airspeed limitation. It is an exact altitude and course between different visual waypoints. Again, that's beyond the scope of what we will realistically fly as glider pilots, so we're not going to spend too much time on it.
Well, it's interesting. I had somebody tell me that you could fly over the center of Detroit at about 1,500 feet. I didn't really believe them.
Let's actually take a look at Detroit. Do you remember what the identifier is for
DTW.
The pie shape that was cut out of the second tier,
Yes.
why is that cut out like that? What is the point of that?
Great question. We'll go back to that momentarily. So at least since they have revised the airspace, you would not be able to fly over the center of Detroit VFR without a clearance.
It hasn't been that long since they revised the airspace there.
Yeah. Now,
What's the red circle?
That's for Willow Run.
no, so those are TFRs. The TFR is a kind of special use airspace. Stands for temporary flight restrictions. And so we can click on it, and you can thank the bureaucratic FAA for this easy to read explanation. But we can see it's translated: high-speed aerial demonstration at the Thunder over Michigan Air Show. So this is an air show from the surface to 16,000 feet, active 10 a.m. Eastern today to noon. And this is the TFR number, and it cites the law that they would fine you with if you violate that airspace. There are different kinds of TFRs. There are VIP TFRs, so presidential travel, presidential candidates, foreign dignitaries. If the Queen, 10 years ago, if the Queen visited or the King of England visits, then they would put up a TFR over that. There also are stadium TFRs, so sporting venues that hold over 30,000 people in attendance, over 30,000 seats of certain sports leagues. During regular season games or races, they will prohibit flight over that stadium, beginning 1 hour prior to the game and ending 1 hour after it ends. If it goes into overtime, it extends that clock where we have to avoid it. This is why in today's modern airspace, I personally fly with electronic charts, and I highly recommend you do as well. You can run a program like this on almost any modern smartphone or tablet. Costs $180 a year, give or take. But in 3 minutes, I can download all current TFRs and charts as I'm walking to the plane.
Is this for flight?
This is for flight, yep. And it overlays that red TFR. So as I'm flying around, I know not to fly into it. Yeah.
When using these digital charts, how much does it drain the battery? Like, how long can you expect to be able to use them?
Yeah, great question. Depends on your device, your battery, age of the device, etc. I can go ahead and keep a chart pulled up with the screen on my iPad, full brightness, flying around for about 6.5 hours, no external battery. However, any mission critical item you should have a redundancy on. I never fly without an external battery pack.
Yeah.
And I also have, on that same subscription, charts on my iPhone. Because when this sits in the sun, in July and August, if you put it up on the dash, it will overheat the iPad and it can just shut down. So it can fail. It fails rather regularly in the summer if you're flying in the Southwest or down in Florida. But it's a tool. They're trade-offs. All right. Let's go back to discussing Class Charlie airspace over Chicago. And so in ForeFlight, I can pull up different kinds of charts. The charts that you see laying around the table right now are VFR sectional charts. That's at a scale of 1 to a half, 1 to a half million on the physical scale. I also can view IFR load charts, so this is what airliners use to navigate. We will go back to the VFR sectional chart, and I will turn off the flyway chart. So now let's discuss Class Charlie airspace. The size commonly extends 10 miles out from the center of the airport. The outer procedures area is not charted, but it begins about 20 miles out from the center of the airport. So when I fly from Plymouth or Marion down to Indianapolis, when I'm about 20 or 25 miles away, I will call up the TRACON, the Terminal Radar Approach Neutral, for Indianapolis, establish the radio comms, and they can begin sequencing me that far out. It makes everybody's job easier because we have more time to plan. Altitudes, we've already reviewed that charting. Entry requirements. The aircraft, before you fly into it, you need to establish two-way radio communications with the controlling facility. So in the case of a Charlie, that is the TRACON, or approach, before you even get into the airspace. So in this case, it would be midway approach. Let's say we were flying into Midway from Indiana at 3,000 feet VFR. 3,000 feet puts us below the Charlie, so we don't have to talk to anybody to enter the Bravo. We're below that, but once we get near Lake Calumet, 3,000 feet would put us inside of the Midway Charlie. So before we cross this boundary, and it's advised even before 10 nautical miles out, so really down here, I would go ahead and call approach. There's a note. Contact Chicago Midway approach within 15 nautical miles on 119.45. Services available in Class Charlie charted airspace only. So unlike Indy, they're not going to sequence you this far out. You're too busy. But you can establish comms early and continue your flight. But the key to enter is you have to hear your tail number. You don't have to hear cleared to enter. So I would make this call. Midway approach. Glider 221 Charlie Whiskey. 15 miles southeast, level 3,000, hypothetically. Inbound for landing. They would come back and say, Glider 221 Charlie Whiskey, roger. At that point, they've acknowledged me, I can enter the airspace. But if they instead were to say, aircraft calling, stand by, you didn't have that conversation. It's like if Dave and I were having a conversation and somebody comes up and starts talking to me and I say, hang on, and we're still talking. I never really acknowledged it. We didn't start our conversation. So think of it like that. You have to hear your name in order to enter your call sign. Services, they can provide radar services for all IFR and participating VFR traffic. Depending on the particular Charlie airspace and how busy they are, they may assign an altitude and a vector, essentially sequencing you in with traffic, or a slower class Charlie, like South Bend, let's say, it's a Vans aircraft. They may say experimental 1, 2, 3, 4. Proceed inbound, advise 4 nautical mile, left base, runway 18. Pretty vague clearance, but then it's on you. You've been cleared in, you've established that comms. You would just advise them when you're on, in that case, a 4 nautical mile left base. Whatever they tell you, you would do. Do you have anything else to add at this point with ATC coordination? Okay. All right. And aircraft equipment. Both Bravo and Charlie airspaces require two-way radio comms. If you are within that 30 nautical mile mode C veil of the Bravo, you need transponder, ADSB out. If you fly in class Bravo in the Charlie airspace, I should say in the class Bravo or in the Charlie airspace, you need that mode C transponder as well and ADSB out. Any questions on class Charlie airspace?
You just need a transponder for Charlie and Bravo.
Yep. All right. And as well as class Alpha, I should say. Class Alpha aircraft needs to be IFR equipped unless you have a letter of agreement as a glider in a wave window, in which case you need to comply with local procedures.
Now, that's an exception on the class Alpha. If you have a wave window, you don't have to have a transponder.
Sure. Yeah, I believe so.
They just block the airspace for the period of time. You know, so if your wave window is from 12 to 3 p.m. till 1500, the airspace is blocked. They don't have to see you out there with the glider. You won't have a transponder, so they won't see you. They'll just block the airspace.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. I believe in Europe they do require more surveillance equipment, even from gliders. And in the future, I would expect that in the US as well, simply because of the increased air traffic. When we're done talking about airspace, we'll talk about how we as gliders can sequence in the modern national airspace system. Make everybody's life easier, especially ours. Yeah.
Clayton, one thing that I seem not to be able to keep clear in my head, could you talk about cloud clearance?
Absolutely.
I didn't know if you were going to go there or not. But.
No, great point. Yeah, so anytime we fly VFR, even if we're receiving radar services, we need to maintain basic VFR weather minimums. And so in Class Alpha, it's IFR, no requirements apply. Class Bravo, we need 3 statute mile visibility, clear of clouds. The reason we don't have to be farther away from clouds is because ATC sees everybody in that airspace. There should be no chance of a 747 jumping out of a cloud 200 feet away. ATC exists to prevent that from happening in a Bravo. Class Charlie, Delta, and most Echo is a standard 3 statute mile, 1,000 feet above clouds, 500 feet below, or 2,000 feet horizontal. So how I remember that is once I get this working. Alright, that's not gonna work. So, Class Bravo, 3 clear of clouds. Charlie, Delta, and Echo below 10,000 feet. 3, 1, 5, think about where you might see a Cessna 152. It would be uncommon to see a 152 in Chicago, O'Hare. But South Bend, Anderson, those are kind of some places where these small Cessnas like to hang out. So 3 152. Now above 10,000 feet, the air is thinner, meaning true airspeeds are higher. It takes more distance to turn, even if you're flying the same indicated airspeed. And so Class Echo airspace above 10,000 feet, our weather requirements increase to 5 statute mile visibility, 1,000 feet above, 1,000 feet below, and 1 statute mile horizontally away from clouds. So that we can remember as 5 111. There's a military aircraft called the F-111. It was a supersonic warbird, and those fly fast and they can fly high. So I always think of it as, okay, we're flying high in Class Echo. We're flying faster. We need more room to maneuver. And then we'll talk about Gulf airspace later on after we work down to it. Cool. All right, so at this point we've reviewed the dimensions, charting, entry requirements, limitations, services, and visibility, cloud clearance requirements for Alpha Bravo Charlie. We'll go back to Class Delta airspace.
Clayton,
Yeah.
on the 111, is that 5 statute miles, 1,000 feet above, 1,000 feet below,
Mhm.
and 1 mile?
It is, yes.
Okay.
Yep, 1 statute mile. When you're flying around, nobody's out there with a ruler or a tape measure, seeing how far you are from clouds. But an easy way to estimate distances is if we have a day with some nice puffy cumulus, I will look at the ground shadows. And in Indiana, we can judge a statute mile as those country blocks. So if I look down and I see clouds, if I see 2 shadows within the same country block, I know they're less than a mile apart. And so if they're right on the edges of 2 roads, exactly 1 mile apart, I can fly between them, maintaining a half-mile separation. Well, that's over 2,000 feet. If I'm below 10,000, I'm good to go. And that's how I can determine if I have the clearance to punch between clouds legally. Sometimes we have a tendency around here locally, when we get towed up, we will kind of feel out where the clouds are, and we may carve around some of the clouds, start out high, drift down past them. Technically, that's not legal, and ultimately, it chips into the window of safety. Because in Echo, people can be flying around without talking to ATC, and there's also IFR traffic that is talking to ATC, but we're not talking to them. So always act as if there is a commercial or corporate jet, like a Cessna Citation, ready to pop out of the clouds. Because I have had that happen. So that can occur. All right, going back to Chicago. If we come on up here, we see Chicago Executive on the north side. This is a Class Bravo, or sorry, Class Delta D airspace, depicted with the dashed magenta line. Normally, it extends about 5 nautical miles out from the airport. In the case of Chicago Exec, you see the notification ends right at this boundary of Class Bravo lower shelf. And then it resumes down here. Meaning, Executive's airspace does not extend into the Class Bravo. So again, we have multiple classes of airspace carved out over these big metro areas. That's about the most complex charting you will see. Now let's move down to a local Class Delta. Anderson Municipal, Darlington Field. We can see it extends about 4 nautical miles away from the airport center. What altitude is Anderson's Class Delta airspace?
2,400.
Yep, that is the top of their airspace.
Where did you get that out? Where's that out?
Yeah, so it's depicted
Oh, okay.
in that box. So from 3,400 to the surface is Anderson's airspace. But we see a chart note. So it says C NOTAMs, notice to, technically they're air missions now, politically correct, but they're notice to airmen. So notice to airmen are bulletins that are sent out with information. We also can check the supplement, the chart supplement, to see the Class Delta effective hours. It's not a full-time 24/7 tower.
Close at 4:30.
Yep, so we'll pull up the chart and look at that shortly. So we've discussed the size and the charting. Entry requirements. You need a 2-way radio in order to enter this airspace. Again, unless you're certificated without a electrical system. Or if you're flying around and that happens to be where the radio station repair, or the radio repair station is, and you have a radio failure, you can follow some special procedures to get in there using light gun signals. So I would expect some written questions out of the test bank to address the light gun signals. So anybody who's studying for that, use Prepware, ASA, Sporties, Dauntless, King Schools, they all reference those charts. And the cloud clearance, again, is that 3,152. Class Delta airspace usually does not have radar. Most Deltas I've flown into are little more than an old 1940s control tower with a guy up there with a radio and binoculars. And so to enter the airspace, you would call up and say, Anderson Tower, in this case we have a Cessna out here, you could say Cessna 1234, 10 miles north, inbound for landing. And Anderson Tower would reply, Cessna 1234, Anderson Tower, advise when on a left base, and whatever the runway number is. We could say, Roger, we'll advise left base. And then you're good to go in. Once you get kind of close, then you'll take the binoculars and it'll say, oh yeah, now I see. Tower is there to increase safety. But again, it's all based on people's radio comms being where they say they are, and the ability of the controller to look out the window, usually, and see traffic. They're getting more supplementary information today, but don't trust them entirely with your safety. Continue doing that VFR traffic scan and stay situationally aware. So we can go over to the airports tab, type in Anderson's
KAID.
ID. Thank you. Anderson, Darlington. We can go over to the info chart supplement. At the top we see this chart supplement is for Indiana, page 93 of the chart supplement book. Scroll down, Anderson Municipal, Darlington Field. And in the airport remarks, we see the times it is attended. Monday through Friday, 1200 to 1300 Zulu. So that's when it's attended. Now for the airspace, Class Delta service is from 1330 to 2130 Zulu, Monday through Saturday. Other times it's Class Golf. So 21:30 Zulu, what is that in local time?
Twenty-one thirty to
4:30.
9:30.
You say 21:30?
Yep.
Yeah.
4:30 p.m.
Yeah, 4:30 p.m. So we take that Zulu, 21:30 minus 4, because we're 4 hours behind Universal time.
Well, we're 5.
Yep. So it is 17:30. So 5:30 p.m. on Saturday is when the airspace stops being Delta and reverts to Class Gulf. So in other words, right now, their Class Delta is active. Just because it's on a weekend, we cannot assume it's safe to fly down near Anderson without talking to them. That's something where, when I was going through training here, I know I was guilty of that. It's real easy when we're flying around, if we catch a good thermal near the IP, we want to go just a little farther south. Again, they're not going to likely violate you for that, but that could be a certificate action if they see you make a pattern of it. So for us, we can be good neighbors by respecting their airspace. Or what I have done in the past, I was on a cross country, kind of local cross country, but I was flying to the south. There was some really good lift down there. So I called them up and said, Anderson Tower, glider 7676, maneuvering 6 miles north. I said, Roger, are you coming into my airspace? I said, well, I may maneuver slightly into the north end of the airport, or your airspace, but I'll remain clear of the airport. He said, Roger, have a good day. I gave him a heads up, we established comms, now I'm legal, now I can chase that thermal, so long as we're all on the same page. So a simple radio call opens that airspace back up, and we're not causing any issues.
And so you know, patrol pilots are supposed to call Anderson when we have flight operations on Saturday.
Great.
We're supposed to advise them that we're call Anderson Tower and advise them that we have glider operations, you know, until 5 p.m. or whatever.
Okay, awesome.
So they know that there's gliders out in the area.
Great, I never knew that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Do you do the same thing when you like have a special day on Friday or whatever day or?
Yeah, we could do that. We should do that too during the week if we have a day. We should call them up and advise them that we are having glider operations, so they're aware that we're out here.
Yeah.
Hey, Clayton,
Yes.
I have a question. Could you go back to the previous screen?
Yep.
That
2-0.
2-0, that means
Frankfurt.
that clears everything as long as you're at least 2,000 feet. But how much leeway is there? Is there like 200 feet or is it 100 feet or 500?
Oh, you mean the 2-0
Yeah.
in there?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is what is known as the minimum elevation figure, MEF. So that says within the sectional chart quadrangle, let me go ahead and turn off some of the clutter here. I'll go out to a easier to see grid. There we go. So for this quadrangle between this line, latitude, and this line, between these lines of longitude, this rectangle's minimum elevation figure, 1,500 MSL. That means you should clear every obstacle in that quadrangle by 100 feet. They take the highest elevation of any known tower, terrain, etc. When this chart was published, they round it up to the nearest 100 feet and add 100. So in this case, you may have a tower at 1375. They'd round up to 1400, add another 100 feet. That's how they get the VFR MEF. Now, just because you're flying 1500 feet does not necessarily mean you're safe or legal. This is simply a quick reference of essentially what altitude you should expect terrain. If you incorrectly set the altimeter, it's very easy to be off by over 100 feet, because that's 0.1 inches of mercury on an altimeter setting. Very localized high or low pressure, like if you're flying around mountains, can cause several hundred feet of altimeter error. And so that's one reason why IFR aircraft do not fly at the MEF. They have much higher minimums for that safety buffer. But if I'm flying at night VFR, the MEF is a very useful figure. I use that as a mental minimum. Until I am on final approach to an airport, I should stay above that minimum. And I know I'm less likely to hit power lines, cell phone towers with a burned out light bulb, etc. Wind farm, yeah. So great question. All right, we'll go back to class Delta. And right now, we see that shaded gray circle over us.
Yes.
That is a NOTAM, unmanned aircraft scheduled. UAS within an area defined as 4 nautical miles of, gives the lat long. So 2.5 miles northeast from the surface to 400 feet, AGL. Active daily from sunrise to sunset, from July 8th to August 20th. More than likely, that is either construction or agriculture drone. They may be putting in a solar farm, or they may be scanning crops. So they should be 400 feet. As a drone pilot, don't trust the drone to be at or below 400 feet. I would expect them to be up to 600 or 800 feet, potentially. They should be, but they sometimes aren't. All right, that brings us to the end of the towered airspaces. Next up, we have Class Echo airspace, which is still controlled, meaning ATC can control and sequence IFR traffic and participating VFR traffic. But Class Echo has no entry requirements. Student pilots can fly there. You also can fly into a Delta without prior training. The only equipment requirements are at and above 10,000 feet MSL, while also being over 2,500 AGL. You need ADS-B out, Mode C transponder. That 2,500 AGL carves out a little close to the ground exception for bush planes. So if you're flying an old Cessna 180 in the backcountry of Idaho over a mountain that stretches up 12,000 feet, as long as you hug that mountain, you don't need ADS-B or a transponder. Class Echo is really broken up into a few different layers, if you will. So I have a really useful teaching aid that I'm going to pull up here. And then I will reconnect after I get that loaded. Any questions so far?
Well, what's the airspace at this field?
So at this field, we are class Golf at the surface, up to 699 feet AGL.
Okay.
Echo begins above Alexandria at 700 feet.
That's basically what it was in Avery.
Yeah. And so we'll walk through the altitudes and charting with a diagram here. this particular example, we're looking at 3 separate starting altitudes for Class Echo. The dashed magenta indicates echo beginning at the surface, meaning you can pick up an IFR clearance on the ground, and ATC can separate IFR traffic from takeoff to landing. A little farther out, we see this shaded magenta, almost looks like a keyhole. Round ring, usually with a box off one side. That indicates on the inner side of that shade, echo beginning at 700 feet. Again, the airspace is charted to sequence instrument approaches for IFR traffic. So for this airport, I would expect they probably have an instrument approach out here. Now, there also technically is charted Class Echo beginning at 1200 AGL. Anywhere inside of a light blue shade. However, that blue shading, because it's based on ATC radar coverage, now envelops 99% of the continental US. So even though you don't see it on the chart, technically echo beginning at 1200 is still charted. This is a small pocket that was out west. You're seeing Augustin Mountains.
The Blythe?
Possibly, I'm not familiar with this area.
It's south of Las Vegas. It's in California, but south of Las Vegas.
Yeah, that makes sense because you have Apache Mountain out here. Yeah, and Laura Peak. Okay. Thank you. So, in this case, we see the shaded magenta is actually extending out in this box. So, all the area out here is what is inside of the shade, indicating echo beginning at 1200 AGL. If it is not charted at all, like in here, technically echo begins at 14,500 feet and extends up to 17,999. So earlier, when we were looking at the Chicago area, we had a pocket of Delta airspace that went right up to Bravo airspace, topped out at 10,000, and above that is echo to the base of Class Alpha. All right, so with the Class Echo, we reviewed the charting. We'll take a look at some local examples here before we move on. Here, we see that magenta shade, and the shade fades toward the inside. So Alexandria, going out about 5 nautical miles, actually more, almost 10, out to Frankton. This is all echo beginning at 700 AGL. Below that, we are Class Gulf. Class Gulf is uncontrolled. ATC has no final authority in that airspace. Now, that doesn't mean the FAA doesn't have authority. It just means ATC can't sequence you. And so we see that magenta shade also encompasses Anderson over past Muncie on a right here. What class of airspace is that? The dotted magenta, dotted pink. What is it?
Isn't it class? It's class B or E? Actually, wait, which one?
Class E.
Class E, beginning at what altitude?
That always confuses me.
1200?
No.
700 or 1200, one or the other.
So right here, it begins at the surface. Class echo beginning at the surface. That magenta shade indicates echo beginning at 700 feet. And we don't see that blue magenta shading anywhere in Indiana. We would have to zoom the chart all the way out to like the border with Canada, but we would see we're inside of that charted magenta light shade. So anywhere we look out here that looks like just open area, it is echo beginning at 1200 GL. So the airspace, if we were to shoot a rocket vertically from Mill Grove, it'd be Gulf from the surface up to 1199 AGL. And at 1200 feet, it would break into controlled airspace. That rocket would remain in class echo until 17,999 feet, and as it hits 18,000, flight level 180, it's class alpha until exceeding 60,000 feet. And then it reverts to class echo infinitely. As of right now, technically ATC has jurisdiction over the United States, in my understanding, all the way out through the universe in that little slice.
Okay, so the moon's in class echo is what you're telling me.
Yes,
Okay.
space is controlled. So there's whole sectional law, space law, with international treaties managing space. So it is controlled. There have been very large model rockets from like university programs where they will reach 80, 90, 100,000 feet. They need a lot of approval from NASA in coordination with international entities to make sure they don't take out the satellite or shoot airplanes in the process. So, but that's the rocket test if we're going from Mill Grove straight vertical out to space. Let's run that same example at Eaton. Second that rocket leaves the launch pad, it is in class echo airspace. And it extends all the way to base class alpha and on up just like before. For us, we are in the shaded magenta. If we launch a rocket, it's in Gulf until 700 AGL, and then echo up to class alpha. All right, good morning. The one remaining class of airspace we haven't talked about yet is class Gulf. Before we move on to that, what questions do you have on class echo? Charting, dimensions, limitations?
Oh, I do have one question about how,
Yeah.
for actually, the pie chart, the pie envelope's cut out of
Yes.
Bravo. Or, and there's also one there, yeah. Why is it cut out like that? What's the point of those pie cuts?
So, when they create airspace, they generally try to leave it as uncontrolled as practical. Relying less on ATC, less investment, everybody's life usually is easier. So what they did is they said, okay, around Muncie, we need class Delta, towered airspace. But it has instrument approaches, so it would be wise to include controlled airspace from 700 feet up, a little ways outside of that Muncie area. But you can see, aligned with the two main runways into Muncie, we have these carve-out boxes. Those indicate instrument approaches, more than likely, giving ATC authority to sequence, and they can vector. If there's a business jet on an instrument approach, they can tell them, right turn, 20 degrees right for traffic, and they can make that little switch. The reason why we have that little pie slice right there, where it's echo beginning at 700, is because if it wasn't for these echo at the surface cutouts, it would just all be echo at 700 on that ring. To help visualize what I'm talking about with instrument approaches, let me pull that up. So that would be MIE. Airport in Delaware County, go to Procedures, Approach, use runway 14. I can send to map. So this is a chart that instrument pilots use instead of flying a rectangular pattern. And what I will do, I will make that plate a little bit opaque for transparent. So it's kind of hard to see, but you can see this bold black line indicating the GPS instrument approach for runway 14. And with the underlined VFR sectional chart, we can see echo beginning at the surface. And sure enough, it aligns perfectly with that instrument approach. So this is a cool way of seeing how airspace interacts. Any other questions? All right, we'll move on to Class Gulf Airspace. Class Gulf Airspace is any airspace left over after the FAA has carved up everything else. It is uncontrolled. ATC does not have jurisdiction. So even instrument pilots, it's on them to avoid other traffic and hope that nobody's hiding in the clouds. These are areas where there's not reliable radar coverage or it's too close to the ground for ATC to see. Traditionally, Class Gulf extended from the surface up to 14,499 feet. Everything above that was echo. Anymore, because remember that echo beginning at 1200, I said pretty much encompasses all of the continental US. Anymore, if we look at a VFR sectional chart, these blank areas, we can assume below 1200 AGL is Class Gulf. In our case, Class Gulf is from that 699 to the surface. There are no entry requirements for the aircraft or the pilot. We don't have to talk to anybody in terms of airspace regulations. And why it matters for us is a different cloud clearance requirements. So, for Gulf airspace below 1200 feet AGL, we need to be 1 statute mile visibility clear of clouds. And I do have a useful chart to put numbers on the board here as I talk. So Class Gulf, oh sorry, it's 1200 AGL. Below 1200 AGL, if you're in Class Gulf airspace, 1 statute mile visibility. At night it goes up to 3 statute miles. And then below that 1200 AGL, clear of clouds. So I will go back to my drawing. Below 1200 during the day, we need 1 statute mile clear of clouds. At night, it changes to 1 statute mile and that 152. Or sorry, 3 statute mile 152.
Okay.
Yep. So standard back to the 3 152s. From 1200 AGL to 10,000. During the day, it changes to 152. Thousand feet above, 500 below, 2,000 horizontal. At night, still 152. And above 10,000 feet, it reverts to the 111, 5 statute miles. 1,000 feet above, 1,000 feet below, 1 statute mile horizontal. All right, that's a lot of numbers. Honestly, it's kind of hard to remember. Here's how we work for it. After I create this graph, I look at it and say, okay, well, echo from 10,000 feet MSL and up, unless we're close to the ground, is always 5 statute miles, 1,000, 1,001 mile, 5, 111. Same with Gulf. If we're close to the ground, within 1,200 feet, it's different. At night, echo is 3,152. Same with Gulf at night. We're at a low altitude, close to the ground, in uncontrolled airspace during the day. This is where you can legally, in the eyes of airspace, scud run. Minimum 1 statute mile visibility, clear of clouds if you're below 1,200 AGL. If you're over 1,200 AGL, you need 1 statute mile, 1,500 to 2,000 feet. Reason I keep using that nuance, same within the eyes of airspace regulation, there are a number of legal precedents and cases where the FAA has held to the fact if you scud run, so let's say you fly a Cessna on an overcast day in class Gulf airspace at 300 feet. Well, for the airspace regulations, that's legal, but it breaks other laws as well. It's careless and reckless. You are below the VFR safe altitudes, which are specified in Part 91. Buzzing people's houses, and the FAA doesn't like it. So since 1940, they've held the position that's careless and reckless. As pilots, it's on us to know all of the regulations that apply to us and how they overlap. Airspace is kind of the first layer of that tier, which is what we've reviewed so far. So this brings us to culmination of all the standard classes of airspace, Alpha through Gulf. We introduced TFRs and NOTAMs, especially use airspace. There also are MOAs and warning areas, prohibited areas, national security areas. Those are items that are beneficial on the test, but we don't see too many of ourselves. I will introduce the MOA quickly, since we have those in the area. This is outside of Grissom. That toothed boundary that looks like a comb indicates 12 mile east at the hilltop MOA, military operating area. Yep, military operations area. So that's where the military goes out and they play. They fly fast, they maneuver, all kinds of cool stuff. You can enter an MOA, but it's not advised if it's hot. So you can either check the chart supplement, the boundaries of the paper sectional charts, the legend, to see when those are operational, or you can always call flight service station and ask them or ATC if the MOA is hot, meaning are they using it for practice. If the MOA is cold, fly through it all day long, very little risk to you.
Between Bloomington and Columbus, there's a big military base.
Yeah.
Canterbury.
Atterbury, thank you. I'm curious what it looks like and how you navigate around that.
Yep.
So if you were trying to get from one side to the other, how would you go about that?
So this is down my neck of the woods. Every single day, usually out of Indy, we have dozens of flights operate around here. The shaded, or not the shaded, the magenta MOA area for Racer Alpha and Bravo, and then Racer Charlie right above it. MOAs, same procedures apply. You can fly through it. If I click on it, there we go. We get details. So that chart legend printed along the boundary says Racer A is active from 500 AGL to about 4,000. Racer B from 4,000 to 8,000. We can pull up details on that. Activation non-continuously, hours, says when it's active. And controlling agency, Indy Center, ARTCC. So if I had questions, I could call Indy Center and ask if the airspace is hot. If it is, it's recommended that you avoid that area. Since it only goes up to 8,000 for flying a power plane, let's fly over it at 8,500 or 10.5. That's always the safer option. Now, the area just to the north, Himsel Army Airfield, those blue combed areas are restricted areas. You cannot fly through that unless you get permission from the controlling agency. Just like with the color codes on other airspace classes. Magenta means less control, blue or cyan means more control. So if you look at those two and you say, well, which is which? Blue has more regulations. Cool.
So where they overlap, like this little area where it's like kind of boxed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wouldn't the B override the A? Why does it show them both overlap like that?
Yeah, so let's take a look at that northwest quarter of it. The restricted area extends from 1,200 AGL to 14,000 MSL. The MOA extends above that
Oh, okay.
to Class Alpha.
Got it.
Yep. So again, we see a layering of different airspace. And this is where if you fly into an area with a lot of special use airspace, study the chart beforehand. Know where stuff is, have a plane going through it. Now, if you're flying around, let's say we planned to fly over the MOA at 8,500 feet. If you have an emergency, like an engine failure, don't be concerned about that airspace. Be more concerned about the emergency. The only times you would get in a lot of trouble for violating airspace during an emergency would be what are known as prohibited areas, national security areas, or around the Washington, D.C. datas. At that point, they really don't care that you don't have a functioning engine. In fact, they care more at that point. So, real quick, I will mention around D.C., you need special training and a certification to fly within, I believe it's 60 nautical miles from D.C.
Is Shelbyville, if you can show me, is that an MOA also?
No.
No?
Nope.
Wow. Okay.
So Shelbyville is class Gulf surface, echo beginning at 700. There is a chart note marks, National Guard helicopter and helipad facility located west of airport. Helicopter traffic all hours. Helicopters usually operate 500-foot patterns. Military helicopters are much heavier than they look. They create enough wake turbulence to create wind shear and potentially roll a small airplane, especially an attack helicopter like an Apache. I have sat on the ground in a pretty heavy Cirrus, on the ground, full tanks. We had a troop of Apaches do a ground taxi, so their wheels were on the ground. They were just generating enough lift to pull them forward, and they were about 100 feet in front of me. It created so much downwash turbulence for me because I was pointed straight toward them, where I saw my airspeed indicator indicate 22 knots, gusting up to 26, and my wings started to bounce while I was sitting at my parking tee. If I'd been in a Cessna 150, I would have been 50% to rotate speed. So keep that in mind. Just like if we're flying around with heavier aircraft, avoid passing right behind and underneath them. That wake turbulence avoidance.
So how far away would you be? Like, how far away realistically could something like that affect you if they were in a flight? Let's say they're ripping along. How far out would you want to say?
Depends on the speed and the weight of the aircraft as well as the wind. So I'll use the example of a 737. In Indy, ATC goes ahead and sequences all of our company planes. They sequence us, so if we're at the same altitude as a jet, we're several miles in trail. If some jet passes over me, perpendicular, they need to either have me right underneath as they pass over, or allow time for that wake turbulence to sink through before I pass through. You might have more experience speaking on that. Do you have anything to share?
No, because I was center, so.
Oh, okay, got it.
Caution right
Yeah.
there, too.
Yeah, so that'd be Trade Mountain and Tower.
Right.
Yeah. You can find more information on this in the back of the AIM. Safety of Flight has a section on wake turbulence. So, standard procedures at a big airport, if you're following a large jet, they will wait a minute after giving it a takeoff clearance before they send you, unless they advise you of wake turbulence. They should wait a minute and a half before a heavy aircraft like a 757 or 767, and they should wait 2 minutes if it is a super heavy, say 380.
What's the classification out for heavy? It used to be 300,000 pounds or greater.
I believe that's still the case.
Still the case? Okay.
Yeah.
As super heavy, do you remember what that?
That is only the Airbus A380.
Airbus 380.
And I think the Antonov.
Oh, right, that one from
Jesus.
Yeah.
Ukraine.
That thing?
The Beluga.
Well, the Beluga's a little different.
Is that weight with the like onboard fuel and stuff? Is that what it's calculated with, or is it
Yeah,
just
I
the
believe
weight
it
of
is yeah, it is the, yeah, either the certificated or maybe the filed weight, because I think it can change. So like if you fly 757 empty, partial fuel on a reposition flight, I think you're just a standard weight turbulence. But if you're carrying 300,000 pounds of cargo plus full fuel, flying to London, then you're heavy.
And it's the way they file it in the flight plan. If their weight is over
yeah.
the weight, they actually put an H in front of the, so it'd be a heavy B757. I wanted to mention something about the military training routes because
Yes, yeah.
that's important for us
That
fighter
is.
pilots.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So, for us, we in our area have a lot of MTRs, military training routes. Any visual training routes are marked with typically a V and a number. Sorry, those are Victor Airways. Yep.
We used to have one that went just to the east of the field that was out of Fort Wayne, came southwestbound, but it might not be there anymore.
Yeah.
Didn't they once upon a time close this with their A10s?
Well, it was A10s, right? It
They're
was
no longer there
A10s.
though, so they might have changed it.
Yeah, they decommissioned that squadron.
Okay, now they're F-16s, right? Out of Fort Wayne?
The F-16s were already there, so
Okay.
they may have changed that. There we go. So this is out in Utah, but you can see that very thin gray line, VR 1260 and VR 1253. Those are visual MTRs, indicating military traffic operating visually. At very high speeds. And I believe if it is 4 digits like we see here, it is below, I believe it's 1500 AGO. If it's 3 digits, it's a little higher.
It's greater than 250 knots, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. We can find information for this in the AIM. Airspace, special use airspace. So section 5, chapter 3, section 5, other airspace areas. Point 2, military training routes. Generally, MTR is established below 10,000 feet for operations in excess of 250 knots. Notation IR denotes they are in accordance with instrument regs. VR, they're visual. If no segment of that particular airway is over 1,500 feet AGL, it has 4 digits. If any segment goes above 1,500 AGL, then it has 3 number digits. If there's a charted MTR, safe assumption is bet that it's active. So if you want to fly through a canyon in Utah in a Super Cub, just on a great Sunday flight, remain clear of those. Because at 250 knots, if they're zipping through at 300 knots in a A10, 400 feet off the deck, you will appear to be standing still. And they will move so fast, it'll be hard to see them, let alone have time to react. On this particular airway, actually, I was fishing in that reservoir, and they had a pair of C-17s come over that reservoir dam at like 200 feet AGL, do a box canyon turn, and fly out. So you'll be surprised at some of the stuff you see along those. There's some famous spots for airplane watchers, especially in the Southwest, where the photographers will sit and get great videos of F-18s or F-15s zooming up right over a mountaintop, doing turns. Those are often long MTRs. Thank you, good addition. Do we have any other questions on airspace? Yeah.
It's a good way to memorize all that data that you just presented, so that we have it on the test, because they're not allowed to have a chart with us
Yes.
showing all those altitudes.
Yeah. So the altitudes for the airspace, like weather minimums, I remember with that 3-152 or 1-152, 1 clear of clouds, 5-111. So I have a short series of numbers I remember for each airspace. There's an excellent video depicting that. So if anybody wants to turn on their airdrop, I can send you that video, or I can just pull it up on on YouTube so you can see the
Yeah, you got a
name.
YouTube.
Can you send it, just log on to the Sorendi website and attach it to all?
Yeah, for an email. Yeah.
Email it to us.
Appreciate it, thank you.
Is that the one where they draw it out kind
Make
of
it easier.
on a map? That's what I used when I was studying. It's very helpful, and if you make your own copy it down, it helps a lot.
Yeah,
It's on YouTube, I think you can share with all of us. But it's someone walks through this video and they have like animate and kind of draw down airspace and write all the numbers down. And kind of use it all along with all this paper.
Is it all in one?
Not only do you get right now, but then you have
I'm on
to
screen.
it helps a lot.
Yeah.
Yes.
I walked in like 30 seconds
Yeah, that would
preparation. But I've also taught this lesson.
Over and over again?
Yeah. Like twice last week.
There's a no-show solar
Again on
panels.
Monday, so.
Yeah.
Oh, but there's a lot of those over in
Oh,
there.
yeah. When I was still on the power grid in northern Indiana, the one, wind farm, they had over 500 towers. And that's, I retired 7 years ago, so they have a lot more.
All right,
East
so-
out of San Francisco.
With the
You see it there.
different information, work through it systematically. Each airspace think of as dimensions, charting, entry requirements, both for the equipment and the pilot, limitations, speeds, do you need permission, and services. Can they sequence drive? Learn that and the weather minimums for every class of airspace. And if the class of airspace is divided into different altitudes, like Echo and Gulfar, memorize for those as well. Unfortunately, it will take a little investment of time either to learn it correctly initially or to refresh on it for our experienced pilots. And it's something I make a point of reviewing at least every month myself, because you saw I misspoke on a few of the dimensions and altitudes. It's very easy if you always run the same mission to forget exactly where some of these weather minimums change off. We forget over time, that's natural, so we have to practice and get those reps in. So there's some excellent study guides out there with pictures and numbers and mnemonics to remember. I don't have any available to share with you right now. If you find one, go ahead and share it and we can send it out. So if you want to email me.
Is that the FAA sectional, that 150-page sectional guide? Is that the one you're talking about?
No.
Oh, this is
These would be like just third-party companies like
Oh.
Bold Method. Bold Method is a company out of Colorado. They have great free online videos and articles. Their information is highly accurate. So Bold Method is good. M0A, most of his stuff is pretty decent. So different YouTube channels. They have videos and drawings, a very sequenced presentation to discuss this.
that was
Bold method.
M0A.
Yeah.
Bold method.
Yeah, M0A, also Fly 8 Mike Alpha. So,
That's a YouTube?
yes.
Okay.
Tell you what, let's go ahead. Those are 3 YouTube channels with excellent videos and graphics and additional private pilot training courses to learn this material.
Can you read the other two? Can't see them from
Oh,
here.
yes. Fly 8, capital M, capital A.
Fly what?
Fly number 8,
Okay.
Mike Alpha, M, A. And then the third channel I recommend is capital M for Mike, 0 spelled out, capital A, Alpha. Airspace and ground school, if we were to teach through every example with repetition to get it memorized in a ground school class, that takes 3 2-hour class periods. Right now is probably about as far in depth as we'll go on airspace today in terms of dissecting all the elements. But we've had a good introduction to the main categories of airspace with all the details discussed, as well as some special use airspace to include MOAs, prohibited areas, TFRs, NOTAMs, like that UAS area, and military training routes, MTRs. Alright. Yeah.
On the written, make sure you know the MOAs in restricted airspaces for military operations, because you'll get a lot of those I found on the written. So that's a good one. Make sure you just know confidently.
Yeah. Knowing how to find information on MOAs, knowing that you can enter an MOA, knowing that you need permission from the controlling agency for a restricted area. Thank you. Yeah.
And taking the written exam and being advised to do some more studying, take it again. I found that there's a lot of questions on there that we do not use in gliding. Is
Yes.
that going to be rectified, or is that going to be a constant thing with the FAA?
So, you might be able to speak to that a little bit better.
On the written test?
Yeah.
I know that it's been going on for about 10 years. They've been trying to get the VOR information on the glider pilot. We don't have VOR receivers in our,
Yeah.
but it's still a problem. I think AOPA is working on it. There's several, but as long as the questions are on the test, you're gonna have to be able to answer. And
Yeah.
I don't know if Jacob, you saw them. I think there
There
on
were
my commercial,
several.
there were 4 questions, I think, on VOR.
There's a lot of them. Most of them have to do with location and
Yeah.
trying to map where you are or what you need to follow in order to work with
Yeah.
those.
So we'll definitely cover that today.
Yeah.
That'll be a focus.
And a lot of them were like trick questions, like
if they were in the
flip
test
you
with the
from.
taxiway markings, because I'd never bothered to study those.
Oh, okay.
I taxi around the airport.
Yeah. So to answer your question in a little more detail, the FAA has a pool of test questions for the private pilot glider. Let me see the exact number.
One of them was 900.
1100 or 900 or?
Just
Yeah.
just 900.
I want to say it's between 600 and 900
Oh, okay.
questions for the private glider. You will be asked 60 of them in a relatively random order. I would expect some questions from every section: airspace, navigation, weather, performance, regs, pilot qualifications, accident reporting, etc. The FAA is in the process of updating their testing standards. So for gliders, any of us with a license have been tested and certified under the PTS pilot test standards. The FAA in the last 5 years, well really 8 years, has switched over to what they call the ACS, Airman Certification Standards. It's a more holistic, different process to test pilots. So that has them looking at all the questions and matching up codes. So the codes on any modern written for airplane directly match the ACS testing supplement that you'll sit down and go through with the DPE on the day of your test. I would expect, it's a low priority for them, but I would expect in the next 4 years, we will probably receive an ACS for gliders. At that point, they will take another look at the questions. Government bureaucracy moves slow. They ask a lot of things that are not totally relevant to us, like Class Bravo airspace. But the fundamentals you learn, especially with those VOR problems, will make you a better airman. If anybody in here wants to pursue additional flying, private pilot airplane or a professional career, this is a great introduction to it. But also with those VORs, later this morning we'll discuss, it develops skills that do benefit us as a glider pilot. So while it's obsolete, I'm still a fan of those questions. Yeah.
A lot of the stuff I'm finding out, Dave, I think you've sort of gotten into this, is, you know, we talk about a private glider license, but now we're getting so many motor gliders, we're getting self-launchers, we're getting all that stuff, which is more than likely them could take us in these larger airspaces than what the glider would. You say, probably not, we will not face a situation where we're going to go up the coastline of Chicago with a glider, but you could with a motor glider, which
Great
takes
point.
the same license.
Yes, great point. Yep.
And it's more and more getting that way, and I wonder if that's going to have an effect on changing the guidelines of the testing.
Quite possibly.
Could, but it's gonna
Yeah.
take such a long time that
gonna
might
take
not
a
see it in
long
my
time.
I mean, that's
lifetime.
several years down the road.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Clayton, have they done away with the NBD?
Mhm.
Well,
Questions
yeah.
yet? Nobody has those.
Mosaic now, that's gonna have a big effect on,
Oh, for the weather.
yeah.
So NDBs, I think there still are a few questions in the test bank. They're pretty straightforward. NDBs are obsolete. I believe we have 2 in the state of Indiana. So even for instrument airplane, I spend about 5 minutes over the course of a student's entire training career discussing NDBs. We don't use them.
What is an NBD?
NDB, it's a form of navigation aid. So we'll talk about that when we introduce VORs. So at this point,
So, let me
yeah.
finish that.
Yeah.
So what this also leads to is the light sport area, which involves some planes,
Mhm.
power planes. When I went through my license, my examiner, he wasn't a big fan of it, but he went ahead and did it because the instructor wanted to. But he went by the guidelines, he does not agree with it. But you've got this power plane out here, but yet you're categorizing that as a glider, and you get your license to cover you on your glider.
So,
Dave, you went through that down there.
Well, yeah, it's part, one of the things, I got my motor glider endorsement.
Endorsement.
Down in Zephyr Hills by
Okay.
Tampa. But I don't know, it depends on how the motor glider's,
yeah.
certified. Is it certified as a motor glider, or is it certified as light sport?
LSA.
Because,
Then you get the sport pilot certificate, which allows you to fly.
but
with it.
can I, as a glider instructor, sign off someone to fly, if he's a light sport pilot, can I endorse his?
Yes.
But is it because of the way the aircraft is certified? It's not certified as a light sport, and I'm a motor glider instructor basically. Can I sign off for him to be able to fly as a light sport?
Yeah.
I probably have to talk to the GATO office about it. I mean, they could tell me the exact.
Right.
'Cause I've tried looking it up, and it's like, whoa, it's so confusing.
Great question. So for anybody else who's listening in, what we're discussing now is how aircraft are certified. So if you look at our airworthiness certificates, they all say glider, and then go from there. If we have a lightweight glider that has a motor for self-launch, it may be considered a light sport aircraft. And then there are really 2 pathways to get qualified to fly that. One is potentially as a glider pilot, and it's just a lightweight glider. We're good to fly it with the motor glider endorsement. Or there's a license out there called the Sport Pilot Certificate. Lower hour requirements, lower medical requirements than a private pilot. A lot more operating limitations, speed, altitude, continued training, endorsements. You need passengers. You need a checkout for almost every single aircraft you fly legally. So it certifies you to fly light aircraft. You have LSAs that are helicopters, that are gliders, that are airplane-like aircraft.
Yeah, the RV can be an LSA.
Depending on the model and how it's
Yeah,
built.
well, it depends on the horsepower.
It does,
Yeah.
and the total weight and the configuration.
Right.
And so that's a pathway as well. To answer your specific question, that's a great question on a CFI initial.
Yeah.
So we can go ahead and discuss that maybe individually.
Yeah,
Because I
that'd be great.
don't want to confuse
Yeah,
everybody.
that's fine.
But any nuances with that are best directed for your instructor. So if you are a rated pilot and you want to get glider qualifications, or even if you're a sport pilot and you're seeking glider qualifications, sit down with your CFI and map out a pathway. Yeah, and then we can discuss that because I think I have the answer for you.
Okay.
All right, now is a great time to take a break. So let's take a 10 or 15 minute break, grab some donuts, bathroom break, whatever.